Every morning for the past 40 years, Thomas has worked his Montana farm alone. He fixes fences, tends to his apple trees, and tries not to think about the girl who left town in 1957. That was a long time ago, but some memories never fade. One fall morning, while checking his fence line, he spots an older woman walking up his driveway. She needs help fixing her broken fence, she says. There's something familiar about her voice, about the way she holds herself. As Thomas gathers his tools, he doesn't realize that this simple fence repair will lead him back to a love story that began decades ago. The brass alarm clock chimes at 5 a.m. sharp, just as it has every morning since Thomas's father first wound it. He doesn't need it anymore. His body knows the rhythm of farm life better than any timepiece. Still, he lets it ring. The familiar sound helps chase away the silence. Thomas rises slowly, his joints protesting the morning chill. October in Montana brings frost early, painting the window panes with delicate patterns that remind him of his mother's lace doilies. He touches the cold glass, remembering how she used to say frost was nature's way of decorating. The morning routine hasn't changed in 40 years. First, he winds the alarm clock. 7 turns, no more, no less. His father taught him that. Too many turns will break the spring, too few won't give it enough power. The clock's brass surface has worn smooth where 3 generations of millermen have touched it. In the kitchen, he puts the coffee on. The percolator bubbles and steams, filling the house with warmth and the promise of comfort. Thomas takes down his father's old farm journal from its shelf. The leather binding is cracked and worn, but the pages still hold decades of weather patterns, crop yields, and the small daily victories and defeats that make up a farmer's life. While the coffee brews, he steps onto the back porch. The sun hasn't cleared the mountains yet, but the sky is turning from black to deep blue. His breath makes clouds in the cold air. Below the porch, the apple orchard stretches out in neat rows, trees standing like silent sentinels in the pre-dawn light. These trees are his legacy. 4 generations of millers have tended this orchard. His great-grandfather planted the first. Trees. His grandfather expanded the rows, his father modernized the irrigation, and Thomas has maintained what they built. Sometimes he wonders if that's enough. Back inside, he pours his coffee into the same blue enamel mug he's used since taking over the farm. The kitchen calendar hangs on the wall, each day marked with simple notes. Check north fence line, prune section 3. Market day. Today's square is empty, waiting for whatever the day might bring. Thomas sits at the kitchen table, just as his father did, and opens the journal. He records the temperature from the thermometer outside the window. 28 degrees. Frost, but not a killing frost. The apples will be fine. He notes the clear sky, the light wind from the north, the promise of a fair day. His handwriting isn't as neat as it used to be, but he takes pride in keeping the records straight. Future generations might want to know about these days, though sometimes, in the quiet of the morning, he wonders if there will be future generations to read these pages. His sister's kids live in Seattle, more interested in computers than agriculture. The coffee grows cold as he writes. Beyond the window, the sky lightens. Another day begins on the Miller farm, much like all the others, but something feels different. This morning, maybe it's the way the wind sounds in the apple trees, or how the light catches the frost. Or maybe it's just that feeling that comes sometimes, that sense that change is in the air. Thomas closes the journal and stands. Time to start the real work of the day. The north fence line needs checking, and there are always apples to tend. 2. He puts on his work coat, the canvas worn soft with years of use. In the pocket, his hand brushes against something, an old photograph he keeps meaning to put away, but never does. He doesn't need to look at it. He knows every detail by heart. A young woman in a summer dress, standing among the apple trees, her dark hair catching the sunlight, her smile bright and full of promise. 1957, a lifetime ago. He leaves the photo where it is and heads out to face another day alone. The garden gate bell hasn't rung in years, Most visitors, the few who come, just drive up to the house, so when its rusty voice breaks the morning quiet, Thomas nearly drops his pruning shears. The sound takes him back. Sunday visitors in their best clothes, his mother rushing to put on fresh coffee, his father setting aside the farm ledger to greet whoever had come calling. But this is 2024, not 1957, and unexpected visitors are rare as snow in August. Thomas sets down his tools and looks toward the gate. A woman stands there, her silver hair catching the morning light. She's wearing a practical jacket and jeans, sensible boots for the muddy ground. City clothes, but chosen with country sense. "Hello?" Her voice carries across the yard, strong and clear despite her age. "Is anyone home?" Thomas wipes his hands on his work pants and walks toward the gate. Something about her seems familiar, like a song heard long ago that you can't quite place. As he gets closer, he notices how she holds herself, straight-backed, chin lifted slightly, a dignity that age hasn't touched. "Can I help you?" he asks, reaching for the gate latch. "I hope so." She smiles, and for a moment time does a strange, sideways skip. "I'm Margaret Carson. I bought the old Peterson place next door." The name doesn't register at first. Peterson's farm has been empty for years, its fences falling, its fields growing wild. Last Thomas heard, some investment company had bought it. But as he processes what she said, it's her first name that catches in his mind like a burr. Margaret. How many Margarets has he known in his life? Only one that mattered. "I'm Thomas Miller," he says, his voice steadier than he feels. "Welcome to the neighborhood." "Miller?" Something flickers across her face, too quick to read. "You must be James Miller's son. You knew my father?" She glances at the apple trees, their branches heavy with late-season fruit. "I knew this orchard long ago, but that's not why I'm here." She turns back to him. "All business now. I've got trouble with my fence line. The realtor mentioned you might be able to help." Thomas nods, grateful for the practical subject. Fences, he understands. Fences don't stir up old memories or ask uncomfortable questions. What kind of trouble? About 50 yards of it is down completely. Mountain winds, I expect, and what's standing isn't much better. "I can take a look," he offers, "get you an idea of what needs doing." She thanks him, and they fall into step together, heading toward her property. The path between their farms is overgrown now, but Thomas's feet remember it. How many times had he walked this way as a boy, running errands for his father? Back when the Petersons were still alive, still farming their piece of the valley, Margaret moves, with surprising ease over the rough ground, no hesitation, no fear of falling. She points out features of the land as they walk, the old oak that marks the property line, the spring-fed creek that waters both farms, the slight rise where wild strawberries grow in summer. She knows this land, Thomas realizes. Knows it like someone who's walked it before, but that's impossible. The Margaret he knew left Montana in '57 and never came back. Married some businessman from California last he heard. Besides, that Margaret had dark hair and laughing eyes, and a way of making him forget his own name when she smiled. This Margaret's hair is silver, her face lined with years. But there's something in her voice, something in the way she moves. "Here we are," she says, stopping at the fallen fence. "What do you think?" Thomas forces himself to focus on the task at hand. The fence is in bad shape, all right. Posts rotted through at the base, wire rusted and sagging. "It'll need replacing," he says. "Not worth trying to patch it." "That's what I thought," she sighs, looking down the line of fallen posts. "I know it's a big job. I can hire someone from town if you're too busy." "No," Thomas says quickly, surprising himself. "No, I can do it. I've got the tools, the know-how. Might take a few days." She smiles, and again time does that strange skip. "I'd appreciate that, Mr. Miller." "Thomas," he corrects her, "just Thomas." "Thomas, then." She looks at him directly, and for a moment he sees something in her eyes. A flash of recognition, a shared memory, but it's gone before he can be sure. "When can you start?" He should check his calendar, should think about the other work waiting for him. But instead he hears himself say, "I can bring my tools over this afternoon, if that suits you." Perfect. She starts back toward his farm, then pauses. "Oh, and Thomas, would you like some apple pie when you come? I was planning to bake one this morning, an old family recipe." The mention of apple pie stirs something in his memory. Another autumn day, another pie cooling on a windowsill, but that was long ago, wasn't it? "That would be nice," he manages to say. "Thank you." As they walk back, the morning sun warms the air, burning off the frost. Behind them, the fallen fence waits for repair. And ahead, the day holds possibilities Thomas hadn't considered when he wound his alarm clock at dawn. After Margaret leaves, Thomas climbs to the attic. He hasn't been up here in years, too many memories gathering dust alongside the old trunks and boxes. The floorboards creak under his feet as he makes his way to a particular corner, where a cedar chest sits beneath the slanted roof. The lid protests as he lifts it. Inside, beneath a carefully folded quilt his mother made, lies a blue book with gold lettering, Jefferson Valley High School, class of 1957. His hands tremble slightly as he lifts it out. The yearbook falls open to a well-worn page. There she is, Margaret Sullivan, second row, third from the left. Dark hair in a neat flip, pearls at her throat, smile bright enough to light up Montana. The same smile that had caught his eye that first day in September 1956. He closes his eyes, and suddenly he's 17 again. The harvest fair is in full swing. Thomas stands at his family's apple booth, arranging Red Delicious in neat rows. The autumn air smells of caramel apples and wood smoke. His father has trusted him to handle sales alone this year, his first real taste of responsibility. Are these as sweet as they look? He turns, and there she is, a girl his age, but not one he knows. She's wearing a blue dress that matches the September sky, and she's holding one of his apples like it's something precious. "Sweeter," he manages to say. "Just picked them yesterday." She takes a bite, and her eyes light up. Juice sparkles on her lips. "You're right." She wipes her mouth delicately with a handkerchief. "I'm Margaret Sullivan. My family just moved here from Chicago. Thomas Miller. These are my family's apples." "Your family's?" She looks out at the orchard in the distance. "All those trees, 4 generations of Millers." He says it with pride, the way his father taught him. Must be wonderful, having such deep roots. There's something in her voice. Longing, maybe. "We moved around a lot. Dad's work." They talk until the sun starts to set. She tells him about Chicago, about life in the city. He tells her about the orchard, about how each season brings its own kind of magic. When her father calls her away, she buys 6 more apples. "One for each day until I see you at school," she says. Back in the present, Thomas runs his fingers over her yearbook photo, below it her loopy handwriting. To Thomas, "Thanks for making this small town feel like home. Love, Margaret." He remembers every moment from that year, walking her home from school, her books tucked under his arm, studying together in the library, stealing glances when they should have been reading, teaching her to drive his father's, truck down quiet country roads, dancing at the spring formal, her head on his shoulder as they swayed to "Love Me Tender." Her father had been the new bank manager, brought in to modernize things. They lived in one of the big houses in town, but Margaret spent every spare moment at the farm. She loved the orchard in all its seasons, spring blossoms, summer shade, autumn harvest. She'd help him with his chores just to spend more time among the trees. "Someday," she'd said once, lying on a blanket under the branches, "I want to plant. Roots like these." No more moving around, just a place to belong. He'd almost asked her then, almost pulled out the ring he'd been saving for, but he'd waited, wanting the moment to be perfect. Waited too long, as it turned out. The next page of the yearbook shows the senior class officers. Margaret, Vice President, standing next to Charles Henderson. President. Charles, whose father owned the largest cattle ranch in the county. Charles, who went to college back east and came home with big plans and a shiny car. Thomas closes the yearbook. Some memories are better left in their boxes. He has work to do, a fence to fix, a farm to run. The past is the past. But as he puts the yearbook away, a small envelope falls from between its pages. Inside, a photograph he's never seen before. Two young people in an apple orchard, laughing at something now lost to time. On the back, in Margaret's handwriting, Thomas and me, October 1956, the day I knew. The day she knew what? He tucks the photo into his shirt pocket, next to the one he always carries. Outside, the autumn sun has burned away the morning frost. Time to gather his tools. Time to fix a fence for a woman who reminds him of someone he used to know, or maybe someone he never stopped knowing at all. Thomas's father's toolbox sits in the bed of his truck, its wooden sides weathered to a soft grey. 3 generations of miller men have carried this box, each adding their own tools, their own marks. He runs his hand along the side where his grandfather carved his initials, HM, the letters almost worn away by time and touch. Inside, the tools tell their own history, the hammer with the worn handle smooth from his father's grip. The rusty fence pliers his grandfather used to mend the boundary line after the big storm of '47. His own tape measure, newer but still showing signs of honest work. The afternoon sun hangs low as he pulls up to Margaret's place. She's waiting on the porch of the old Peterson house, and something about the way she stands there makes his heart skip. The photo in his pocket seems to burn against his chest. "I made coffee," she says, holding up a thermos. "Thought we might need it." They walk the fence line together, Margaret pointing out the worst spots while Thomas makes mental notes. The old toolbox bumps against his leg, carried by its leather strap just as his father used to carry it. "These posts," he says, testing one with his hand. "They're the originals from when Peterson first divided the property. 60, maybe 70 years old, about that." Margaret nods, then catches herself. At least, that's what the realtor said. Thomas looks at her sharply, but she's already moving on to the next section of fence. The late sunlight catches her silver hair, and for a moment he sees another color there, dark as coffee, shining in a long-ago summer. "We'll need to dig new post holes," he explains, forcing himself to focus on the task. 18 inches at least. The frost gets deep here. "I remember the winters being harsh." She says it casually, then adds quickly, "In Montana, I mean. When I was young." They continue their assessment, professional words covering the growing tension between them. Thomas measures spans with his father's old wooden ruler, Margaret noting down the numbers in a small notebook. Their hands brush once as she hands him the thermos, and both pull back too quickly. The old toolbox sits between them as they rest on a fallen log, discussing lumber needs and wire specifications. Its presence is oddly comforting, like having his father there to steady him. "That box," Margaret says suddenly, "it looks familiar. Been in the family a long time. Does it still have that false bottom? Where your father kept his special tools?" Thomas stares at her. Nobody knew about that compartment except family. His father had added it himself, a secret space for his finest tools, the ones too precious for everyday use. But Margaret is already standing, brushing off her jeans. "We should finish before we lose the light," she says briskly. "How many posts did you say we'd need?" He gives her the number, his mind spinning. The Margaret he knew had never seen this toolbox. She'd left before his father passed it down to him, unless... "About 40 feet here needs complete replacement," he says, measuring another span. "The rest we might be able to salvage." "Just like Peterson's old fence," she murmurs, "always patching, never replacing. Some things don't change." Their eyes meet for a moment, and Thomas sees something there, a flicker of recognition, quickly hidden. The photo in his pocket seems heavier now, a weight of unspoken words and unanswered questions. As the sun sets behind the mountains, they finish their assessment. The job will take several days, maybe a week. 7 new posts, fresh wire, 100 small repairs. Time spent together, working side by side, just like Thomas closes the toolbox, its latch clicking with familiar finality. "I can start tomorrow," he says. "If that works for you, tomorrow's perfect." She hesitates, then adds, "I'll make more pie." He watches her walk back to the house, her figure silhouetted against the evening sky. The toolbox feels heavy in his hand, weighted with more than just iron and wood. Heavy with memories, with questions, with the possibility that sometimes the past isn't as far away as we think. Behind him, the old fence lies waiting for repair. Ahead, the promise of tomorrow stretches out like an unwritten page. And in his pocket, 2 photographs whisper their secrets in the gathering dark. Morning brings a hint of warmth to the Montana air. Thomas arrives early, his truck loaded with posts and wire. From Margaret's porch, an old radio plays softly, one of those vintage ones that still picks up AM stations. The music drifts across. The Yard, a song from decades past. You're My Everything by Johnny Mathis. 1957. Thomas grips the steering wheel tighter, remembering another radio, another time. Margaret stands on her porch, holding 2 travel mugs of coffee. She's wearing work gloves that look newly bought. "Thought we could use some music while we work," she says as he approaches. "Found this old radio in the Petersons' attic. Still works, if you can believe it. Dad used to say good tools last forever if you treat them right." Thomas accepts the coffee, careful not to let their fingers touch. "Ready to learn about fence building?" She smiles, and something in her eyes makes him wonder if she already knows more than she's letting on. "I'm a quick study." They start with the post holes. Thomas demonstrates the proper technique with the post hole digger, the rhythm of diggy. And lift, dig and lift. Margaret watches, then takes her turn. Her form is surprisingly good, almost like she's done this before. "Not your first time with a post hole digger?" he asks casually. "Oh, you pick things up here and there." She wipes her brow. "Life teaches you all sorts of skills." The radio plays on, one old song flowing into another. They work steadily, falling into an easy rhythm together. When their hands bump passing tools, neither pulls away quite as quickly as yesterday. "My father," Margaret says suddenly, setting a post in place, "he always wanted me to have a city life. Office job, nice house, in the suburbs. He thought farm work was beneath us." Thomas holds the post level while she tamps the soil around it. "And what did you think?" "I thought," she pauses, pressing the soil firm, "I thought there was something honest about working the land, something real." Their eyes meet over the post. The morning sun catches her face just right, and for a moment Thomas sees her as she was, young Margaret Sullivan, helping him pick apples on a golden autumn day. The radio crackles, changing songs. Elvis now, "Love Me Tender." Margaret's hands falter on the tamping bar. "We can change the station," Thomas offers. "No." Her voice is soft but steady. "I like the old songs. They remind me of simpler times." They break for water around mid-morning. Sitting on the tailgate of his truck, they look out over their morning's work. 3 posts set, straight and true. The radio plays on, gentler now. Patsy Cline singing about falling to pieces. "You know," Margaret says, studying her water bottle, "I drove through here once about 20 years ago. Saw the Miller Orchard sign on the highway." Thomas's heart quickens. "Oh? I almost turned in." She traces a pattern in the dust on the tailgate. Almost. Before he can respond, she's up and moving, back to work. Thomas watches her go, remembering another almost. A ring in his pocket, words unspoken, time running out. They work through the morning, the pile of old posts growing as they pull them from the earth. Each one comes with its own story, a knot. Here, a weather crack there, years of holding up under Montana skies. "Look at this," Margaret calls, pointing to one of the posts. There's something carved in the wood, faint but still legible. 2 sets of initials, the date worn away. Thomas feels the photo in his pocket like a hot coal. He knows, without looking closer, what initials they are. He'd carved them himself, one spring evening when hope was as fresh as the new leaves on the apple trees. "Old post," he says gruffly. "Best add it to the burn pile." But Margaret's already tracing the letters with her finger. MS and TM. Her voice is barely a whisper. Thomas Miller, were you in the habit of carving your initials with many girls? The radio chooses that moment to play We'll Meet Again by Vera Lynn. The irony isn't lost on either of them. Just one, he says finally. A long time ago. She nods, still not looking at him. She must have been special. She was. Thomas picks up the post-hole digger. We should get back to work. Lights burning. They work on, the radio playing its soundtrack of memories. With each post set, each stretch of wire strung, the fence takes shape. But something else is taking shape too. Something built of shared glances and half-finished sentences, of memories sparked by old songs and carved initials. By day's end, they've made good progress. The new post stands straight and proud, ready for tomorrow's wire. The radio plays its last song of the day. Unchained Melody. Same time tomorrow? Margaret asks, pulling off her work gloves. Thomas nods, loading tools into his truck. I'll bring my father's wire stretcher. It's old, but it still works better than anything they make today. Like the radio, she says softly. Some old things just keep working, don't they? Even after all this time. He drives home in silence, the day's songs still echoing in his head. In his pocket, the photos seem to whisper their own melody, a tune about time and chance, about fences that need mending and hearts that never quite forgot. The aroma of apple pie drifts across the porch as Margaret sets out their lunch. She's spread a red checkered cloth over the old picnic table, the pattern faded but clean. Thomas watches as she places a familiar-looking pie tin in the center. Is that, he stops uncertain, an aluminum pie tin from Miller's Market? Yes. Margaret smooths the tablecloth. Found it in Peterson's kitchen, must be 30 years old at least. But Thomas knows it's older. The Miller's Market logo, stamped on the bottom, hasn't been used since 1957. His mother used to sell pies, in tins just like this one. The recipe, Margaret continues, cutting perfect triangles, is one I learned a long time ago. Cinnamon, nutmeg, and one secret ingredient. Cardamom, Thomas says without thinking. Just a pinch. Their eyes meet. Across the table, Margaret's hand trembles slightly as she serves the pie. Mother Miller's secret, she says softly. She only shared it with people she considered family. Thomas takes a bite. The taste floods his mouth with memories. Sunday dinners, harvest, celebrations, and one particular autumn evening when his mother taught a dark-haired girl her closely guarded recipe. It's perfect, he manages to say. They eat in silence for a moment, the only sound the gentle creak of the porch swing in the breeze. From somewhere in the yard, the old radio still plays, its music barely audible but present, like a soundtrack to their thoughts. You know, Margaret says, studying her plate, I've baked this pie at least once a year since 1957. My children grew up on it. My grandchildren request it for special occasions. But you told them it was your recipe. She shakes her head. No, I always said it was from a dear friend's mother, someone who taught me about more than just baking. Thomas remembers his mother in the kitchen, showing young Margaret how to crimp the edges just right. A pie crust is like life, she'd said. You can't work it too hard, or it gets tough, but handle it too gently and it falls apart. Your mother, Margaret says, as if reading his thoughts, she was the first person who made me feel like I could belong here. In Montana, I mean. She had that way about her. Thomas reaches for another piece of pie. Dad was the same. Never met a stranger, he'd say, just friends he hadn't talked to yet. Margaret smiles, but there's sadness in it. I went to their funeral. Your father's, I mean. I stood at the back. You were surrounded by so many people I didn't think. She trails off, leaving the thought unfinished. Thomas tries to remember that day, 15 years ago, but it's a blur of black suits and casseroles and condolences. I saw you, he says. Didn't know it at the time, but I remember now. A woman in a blue dress slipping out before the service ended. I shouldn't have come. She starts gathering plates. But when I read about it in the Chicago Tribune, I had to say goodbye. Your father was always kind to me. Even after, The question hangs in the air between them. Margaret's hands still on the dishes. Even after, she confirms. He wrote to me, you know. Once a year, just a few lines about the orchard, about you. Thomas stands abruptly, needing to move. The porch feels too small suddenly, too close. He walks to the railing, looks out over the half-finished fence. Behind him, he hears Margaret stacking dishes with careful precision. "I never knew," he says finally. "There was a lot we never knew." Her voice is closer now. She's standing beside him, not touching, but near enough that he can smell the lingering scent of cinnamon and cardamom. A lot we never said. The radio in the yard catches a clear signal for a moment. Nat King Cole singing "Unforgettable." Thomas grips the porch railing tighter. "We should get back to work," he says. "Still plenty of daylight left." Margaret nods, stepping back. "Yes, of course. The fence won't fix itself." But as they return to their labor, the taste of apple pie lingers, sweet and spiced with memory, filled with secrets that taste like cardamom and regret. The afternoon sun beats down as they return to the fence line. Thomas reaches into his pocket for a handkerchief to wipe his brow, and the old photograph slips out, landing face up in the grass. Before he can grab it, Margaret picks it up. Time stops. The radio in the distance fades to silence. Margaret stares at the image of her younger self, standing among the apple trees, laughing at something long forgotten. "You kept it." Her voice is barely a whisper. All these years. Thomas doesn't move. Can't move. The moment hangs between them like a soap bubble, fragile and iridescent with possibility. "I always wondered," she continues, still staring at the photo, "if you'd thrown away everything from that summer. I wouldn't have blamed you. Tried to." His voice comes out rough. "Couldn't." Margaret reaches into her own pocket, pulls out a worn leather wallet. From behind her driver's license, she withdraws a folded photograph. The creases are deep, the edges soft from years of handling. She unfolds it carefully, holds it out. Two teenagers sit on the tailgate of an old pickup truck sharing an apple. The boy is pointing at something in the distance, and the girl is looking at him instead of where he's pointing. The love in her eyes is unmistakable. "Your father took this," she says. "October 3rd, 1956. You were showing me where you wanted to plant the new saplings." Thomas remembers that day with sudden clarity. The crisp autumn air, the way the sun caught her hair, the weight of the ring box in his jacket pocket. He'd planned to ask her that afternoon, but lost his nerve. "Maggie," he says, using her old name for the first time in 67 years. She closes her eyes at the sound. "Nobody's called me that since then." The radio crackles to life. Again, as if on cue, Frank Sinatra's "The Second Time Around" drifts across the yard. Margaret lets out a small laugh that might be a sob. "Of all the songs," she shakes her head, "do you remember teaching me to dance to this in your father's barn? You kept stepping on my feet." The memory comes easily now, like a door long, stuck suddenly swinging free. "But you wouldn't give up until you got it right." 3 hours, she smiles at the photograph. "My shoes were ruined, but I didn't care. I just wanted to be perfect for the harvest dance." Thomas looks at her now, really looks at her. The silver hair, the lines around her eyes, they don't hide the girl she was. They just add chapters to her story. "Why did you come back, Maggie?" She takes a deep breath. "Because it was time. Because my husband died last year, and I found myself thinking more and more about this place, about unfinished. Business and roads not taken. And the Peterson place, of all the farms, it wasn't an accident." She meets his eyes steadily. "I knew it shared a fence line with your orchard. Knew we'd have to talk eventually." The afternoon light softens, painting everything in shades of gold. In the distance, the apple trees, Thomas, planted the year after she left, stand tall and strong, heavy with fruit. "I looked for you," he says quietly, "after you left. Your father said you'd gone to California, married some businessman." "I did." She touches the wedding ring she still wears. "Robert was a good man. We had a good life, 3 beautiful children, but he knew. He always knew there was a part of me that stayed here in Montana. With you. Thomas pulls out his wallet, opens the hidden compartment behind the bills. From it, he takes a small, yellowed envelope. Inside is a pressed apple, blossom, fragile as a butterfly's wing. From the day we met, he says, at the harvest fair. Margaret reaches out, her fingers hovering over the delicate petals but not quite touching. You saved it, all this time? Some things you can't throw away, no matter how hard you try. The radio changes songs again. This time it's At Last by Etta James. They stand there holding their photographs, their memories, their shared past, laid bare between them like the fallen fence they're supposed to be fixing. We should talk, Margaret says finally. Really talk, Thomas nods. Yes, but first, he holds out his hand, palm up. After a moment's hesitation, she places her hand in his. Their fingers intertwine, familiar despite the years between then. And now, dance with me, Maggie. One more time, and there, beside the half-mended fence, with the late afternoon sun painting everything in shades of memory and hope, they begin to sway to the music. This time she doesn't step on his feet once. They end up on Margaret's porch as the sun begins to set. A stack of undelivered letters sits between them on the old picnic table. Letters Margaret pulls from a canvas bag she's brought from inside. Each envelope is addressed to Thomas Miller, Miller Orchards, Montana. None were ever sent. I wrote to you every week that first year. Margaret's hands rest on the stack. Then every month, then on birthdays and Christmas. After a while, just when the apples would be ripening, Thomas stares at the letters, their edges softened by decades of storage. Why didn't you send them? At first, because my father forbade it. Later, because I thought it was too late. She selects one letter from the middle of the stack, the paper yellow with age. This one explains everything. I wrote it the night I left. Thomas takes it with trembling hands. The paper feels fragile, like it might crumble under the weight of too many unspoken words. Dear Thomas, he reads aloud, by the time you read this, I'll be on a train to California. I know you'll hear all sorts of stories about why I left, about Charles Henderson and his fancy car, about his father's money and his plans for me. None of them are true. He looks up at Margaret. She nods for him to continue. The truth is, Daddy's bank is failing. The audit showed he's been moving money around, trying to keep things afloat. They're giving him a choice, resign quietly and take a position with their California branch or face charges. He says, if we don't leave now, tonight, everything will fall apart. He'll go to prison. The scandal will ruin us all. Thomas's voice falters. The old hurt mixes with new understanding. I wanted to tell you, Margaret says softly, that last day, when we were planning the harvest dance decorations. The words were right there, but Daddy made me swear, said it would be better for everyone if we just disappeared. Your father, Thomas remembers the bank manager's sudden departure, the rumors that flew around town. They said he'd been offered a promotion. That's what everyone was supposed to think. The bank wanted to avoid a scandal as much as he did. She pulls another letter from the stack. This one's from a month later, after I heard about you and Sarah Jenkins at the Christmas dance. Sarah Jenkins? Thomas shakes his head. I only took her because I'd left without a word and she was kind to you. I know. Margaret smiles sadly. Your father told me in one of his letters. The radio, still playing in the yard, catches a clear signal. Perry Como's "And I Love You So" drifts up to the porch. He wrote to you about Sarah? He wrote to me about everything. The orchard, the new trees you planted, how hard you worked. She pauses. How long it took you to smile again. Thomas remembers those dark months after she left. The way he'd thrown himself into work, planting row after row of new trees, as if he could grow something to fill the empty space she'd left. I almost came back, she says. In '59, I'd saved enough for a bus ticket, had it all planned out. What stopped you? I saw the announcement in the paper, your engagement to Mary Beth Carson, an engagement that lasted all of 2 weeks. Thomas runs a hand over his face. She wanted to modernize the orchard, turn it into one of those pick-your-own tourist operations. I couldn't do it. And then, life went on. I had the orchard. It was enough. He looks at her. What about you, your husband? Robert, Margaret's voice softens. He knew about you, right from the start. I told him everything before we married. He said, she blinks back tears. He said he'd rather have part of my heart freely given than all of it given under false pretenses. He sounds like a good man. He was. We had 38 good years. Together, 3 children. A life filled with love and purpose. She touches the stack of letters. But every autumn, when the apples would be ripening in Montana, I'd write another letter I'd never send. Thomas reaches into his pocket, pulls out his wallet again. From behind the pressed apple blossom, he removes a small, worn piece of paper. I wrote 2, he says. Just 1 letter. Rewrote it every year on your birthday. He unfolds it carefully. The paper is thin from countless foldings and unfoldings. Margaret takes it with gentle hands, reads the single sentence written there. I hope you found what you were looking for, and I hope it made you happy. Did you? He asks. Find what you were looking for? Margaret looks out over the yard to where their half-finished fence cuts across the landscape. The setting sun turns everything golden, like a photo faded by time. I found a good life, she says slowly, but there was always something missing. A piece of my heart I left here, among the apple trees. The radio plays on as darkness begins to fall. They sit in comfortable silence, surrounded by letters that tell the story of 2 lives lived apart, but never fully separated. It's not too late, you know, Thomas says finally, to finish that fence. Margaret understands he's not just talking about the fence. No, she agrees. It's not too late at all. That night, Thomas sits at his kitchen table. Margaret's letters spread before him. The old brass lamp casts a warm glow over pages that smell of cedar and thyme. He's been reading for hours, watching their parallel lives unfold through her unsent words. October 1957. The apples must be ready for harvest now. I close my eyes and I can smell them, feel the scratch of branches against my arms as I reach for the highest fruit. March 1958. Spring must be coming to the orchard. Are the blossoms as pink as I remember? Does the morning frost still make them look like sugar-dusted lace? December 1960. I saw an apple tree today in someone's yard. For a moment, I was 17. Again, watching you check the grafts on the new saplings, so careful with each tiny branch. Each letter reveals another piece of the life she lived away from Montana. Her college graduation, her first teaching job, meeting Robert, their wedding, where she carried apple blossoms in her bouquet, the births of her children, Michael, Sarah, and Catherine. Through it all, the orchard remained her touchstone, the place her mind returned to in quiet moments. Meanwhile, in the Yule Peterson house, Margaret sits in the window seat, holding Thomas's single, much rewritten letter. The paper is soft as cloth from years of handling. She's lost count of how many times she's read that one line. I hope you found what you were looking for, and I hope it made you happy. She takes out her own wallet, removes a photograph hidden behind her grandchildren's school pictures. It's a newspaper clipping from 1975, yellowed and creased. Miller Orchards wins State Fair blue ribbon. In the grainy photo, Thomas stands beside a display of perfect apples, his father's proud smile on his face. Robert had seen her cut it out of the Chicago Tribune. You should write to him, he'd said. Tell him congratulations. But she just tucked the clipping away, another piece of the life she'd left behind. Now she looks out her window toward the orchard. The moon has risen, painting the apple trees silver. Somewhere over there, Thomas is probably reading her letters, learning about the life she built in California, about Robert, who loved her enough to share her heart, about her children, who grew up on stories of Montana autumns and the taste of apple pie made with cardamom. In his kitchen, Thomas reaches. The last letter, dated just 3 months ago. Robert's been gone a year now, she'd written. The house feels too big, too full of echoes. Yesterday I found myself looking at real estate listings in Montana. The Peterson place is for sale. It shares a fence line with the orchard. Is that a sign, or am I just an old woman chasing ghosts? He looks up from the letter, out toward where the Peterson house stands dark except for one window. A figure sits there, silhouetted against the lamplight. Without thinking, he raises his hand in greeting. After a moment, the figure waves back. Margaret watches Thomas's gesture and returns it, remembering another night, another window. She'd sat in her bedroom in town, watching his truck drive past each evening after chores. Sometimes he'd stop and they'd talk for hours, her leaning out the window, him standing in the garden below. She picks up her phone, looks at the latest text from her daughter Sarah. "How's the fence coming along, Mom?" More importantly, how's the handsome neighbor? She hasn't told her children the whole story yet. How do you explain to your grown children that you're reconnecting with your first love after 67 years? That sometimes life gives you a second chance, if you're brave enough to take it. In the orchard, an owl calls, its voice carrying clearly through the night air. Both Thomas and Margaret smile, remembering how they used to imitate that sound, to signal each other during late-night meetings by the old oak tree. Thomas gathers the letters carefully, returning them to their envelopes. Each one is a piece of the puzzle that was Margaret's life. A life lived fully, but always with a piece of her heart here in Montana. Margaret folds Thomas's letter, tucks it back into her wallet behind the newspaper clipping. Tomorrow, they'll work on the fence again. Tomorrow, there will be more words, more memories, more chances to bridge the gap that time and circumstance placed between them. For now, they sit in their separate houses, connected by moonlight and memory, by words written but never sent, by a love that somehow survived 67 years of silence. Between them, the half-mended fence stands as both boundary and bridge, marking where they've been and pointing toward where they might go. The night deepens. The owl calls again. And in two houses connected by starlight and history, two hearts beat in quiet synchronicity, readying themselves for whatever tomorrow might bring. Morning arrives with the scent of rain on the wind. Thomas steps onto his porch, breathing in the familiar smell of approaching weather. In his hand, he holds a small paper packet that's traveled with him through decades. Margaret's morning. Glory seeds from their shared garden in 1957. The seeds never got planted that year. She left before spring came. He'd found them in his jacket pocket weeks later and somehow could never bring himself to throw them away. As he drives to Margaret's, he sees her already in the yard. She's wearing one of his old work shirts over. Her clothes, she must have found it in his truck yesterday. The sight of her in the faded blue cotton makes his heart skip like he's 17 again. "Thought we'd better get an early start," she calls as he parks. "Storm coming later." You always could smell the weather changing. He climbs down from the truck. "Used to drive my father crazy how you'd predict the rain better than his knee." She laughs, the sound rich and free now that there's no need for pretense. "He called me his human barometer, said I was more reliable than the radio forecast. They fall into work easily, their movements more natural now that they're not hiding from their shared past." Margaret hands him tools without being asked, remembering his preferences from long ago. "You still organize everything the same way," she notes, watching him lay out the fence supplies. Tools on the left, materials on the right. Some habits stick. He pauses, then pulls the seed packet from his pocket. Speaking of old habits, Margaret's breath catches when she sees the familiar envelope. "You kept them all this time? Never seemed right to plant them without you." He holds them out. "Thought maybe, if you're planning to stay." She takes the packet with gentle hands. The paper is soft with age, her teenage handwriting still visible. "Morning glories, blue and purple mix. I have the perfect spot," she says, "along the new fence. They can grow up both sides, join our properties together. The symbolism isn't lost on either of them." They work through the morning, setting posts and stretching wire. Their conversation flows easier now, filling in the gaps of their years apart. Catherine, my youngest, she reminds me of your mother, Margaret says as they secure a corner post. Same way of looking at things sideways until they make sense. Same laugh. And your boy. Michael, right? Just like his father. Robert, I mean. Steady, thoughtful. The kind of man who builds things to last. She tests the post's stability. Your father would have liked him. A few raindrops begin to fall, but they keep working. There's a rhythm to it now, a dance they remember from their youth. Pass the wire, hold the stretcher, check the tension. Their hands brush more often and neither pulls away. I used to dream about this, Margaret admits, securing a staple. Working beside you, building something together, even when I was happy with Robert, those dreams would come. I dreamed too, Thomas says quietly, usually during harvest. You'd just be there, picking apples like no time had passed. The rain falls harder. They should stop, wait it out, but neither moves to take shelter. The water runs down their faces, and Margaret reaches up to wipe a drop from Thomas's cheek, the gesture achingly familiar. We've wasted so much time, she whispers. No! He catches her hand, holds it against his face. You had a good life, a family, love. That's never waste. And now? Thunder rumbles in the distance. Thomas looks at their joined hands, at the fence taking shape behind them, at the morning glory seeds waiting to be planted. Now we build something new, he says. Something that honors the past but doesn't live in it. Margaret squeezes his hand, then reaches for the next piece of wire. They work on through the rain, talking and remembering, planning and dreaming. The fence grows stronger with each post set, each wire stretched taut and true. And in Margaret's pocket, the morning glory seeds wait for tomorrow's planting, ready to bloom again after 67 years of patience. Word travels fast in small towns. By the time Thomas and Margaret stop at Miller's Market for fence supplies, the whispers have already started. Old Mrs. Henderson, who runs the register now in her late 80s, peers at Margaret over her reading glasses. Well, if it isn't Margaret Sullivan, she says, her voice carrying across the store, though I suppose that's not your name anymore. Margaret Carson now, Margaret replies steadily. It's been a long time, Betty. Betty Henderson unfolds a yellowed newspaper from beneath the counter. The date reads June 15th, 1957. The headline announces, "Local girl engaged to rancher's son." Kept this all these years, Betty says. My Charles never did get over you disappearing. Like that. Turned down every girl in the county after you left. Thomas stiffens beside Margaret, but she places a gentle hand on his arm. That was a lifetime ago, Betty. Ancient history now. Is it? Betty's eyes move between them. Seems. To me, some history isn't so ancient after all. They gather their supplies in silence, aware of the curious eyes following them through the store. Near the register, a group of older women whisper behind their shopping lists. Thomas recognizes them, the same girls who used to giggle in the hallways when he and Margaret walked by in high school. Outside, Margaret leans against Thomas's truck, letting out a long breath. Well, that was interesting. Small towns never forget, Thomas says, loading the supplies. Or forgive, sometimes. I remember how it was. Every romance, every heartbreak, public property. She smiles wryly. At least we're giving them something new to talk about. They drive through town, and Margaret notes the changes. The old movie theater is now a craft store. The soda fountain where they shared their first milkshake is a real estate office. But some things remain. The courthouse clock still chimes the hours, and the town square still hosts the weekly farmers' market. Speaking of which, Thomas says, my regular spot at the market is open tomorrow. Could use some help selling apples if you're interested. Are you sure? After what just happened at the store? Let them talk. He maneuvers the truck around a corner. Besides, you always were better at charming the customers. A police car pulls alongside them at the stop sign. The officer tips his hat, and Margaret gasps softly. Is that little Tommy Jenkins? Not so little anymore, Thomas chuckles. Sarah's boy, been chief of police for 5 years now. Tommy, Chief Jenkins now, signals them to roll down the window. "Miss Margaret," he says with a grin. "Mum's been hoping you'd stop by. She's got some stories to tell about a certain apple pie contest in '57. Sarah Jenkins," Margaret says warmly. "How is she?" "Still making that awful pie. Never could get your recipe right." He winks. "Though maybe now you can teach her yourself." As they drive on, Margaret shakes her head in wonder. "Sarah Jenkins. I felt so guilty about her, you know. Your father wrote that you took her to the Christmas dance." "She knew," Thomas says quietly. "About us, I mean. She's the one who found me that day, sitting in the orchard after your father's car drove away. Brought me soup for a week straight. Said broken hearts need feeding." They pull into the lumberyard for more posts. The owner, Bill Matthews, is older than both of them, but still sharp as a tack. His eyes light up when he sees Margaret. "Well, look what the wind blew back to town." He waves away Thomas's credit card. "This one's on the house. Consider it a welcome home present." "Bill, you don't have to—" "Hush now. My Eleanor would come back and haunt me if I charged you two lovebirds for building a fence between your properties." He leans in conspiratorially, "Though seems to me you're building more of a bridge than a fence." Back in the truck, Margaret turns the lumberyard's local paper over in her hands. There, in the community notice section, someone has already announced, "Local girl returns home after 67 years. Love blooms again at Miller Orchards." "They make it sound like a Hallmark movie," she says, but her eyes are bright with unshed tears. "Maybe it is." Thomas reaches over, takes her hand. "Though I'd say we've got a better story." They drive back to the farm, the truck bed full of supplies, the air full of whispers and memories and possibilities. Behind them, the town buzzes with the news. Ahead of them, the fence waits to be finished. A project that's become less about separating properties and more about join. Saturday morning dawns clear and cool. Thomas pulls the old Miller's Apples sign from his truck, hand-painted by his father decades ago, the letters still crisp against the weathered wood. Margaret runs her fingers over the familiar lettering. "Your father was so proud of this sign," she says. "I remember him touching up the paint every spring, humming while he worked." They set up their stand in Thomas's usual spot, beneath the sprawling oak tree in the town square. Margaret arranges the apples with practiced ease, making pyramids of red and gold fruit. Her hands remember the work, even after all these years. "You still sort them the same way," Thomas observes. "Sweet varieties on the left, tart on the right. Some lessons stick with you." She adjusts a Honeycrisp. "Your mother taught me that. Said customers like to know what they're getting at first glance." The market opens at 8, and the regulars arrive first. They pause at the sight of Margaret behind the counter, recognition dawning in their eyes. Some hurry past, whispering. Others stop to stare. But then Ellen Martinez, who's bought Thomas's apples every week for 30 years, steps forward. "Lord," above, if it isn't Margaret Sullivan. Ellen embraces her warmly. "Welcome home, honey. We've missed your smile around here." The ice breaks. People gather around, not just to buy apples, but to share memories. Margaret meets grandchildren of old friends, catches up on decades of town history. She handles it all with grace, never letting the apple display get disorganized, never missing a sale. "Remember when we used to sneak over to Miller's Orchard to steal apples?" Old Joe Fisher asks, leaning on his cane. "And you'd always leave a nickel on the fence post to pay for them." Margaret laughs. "And Mr. Miller would pretend not to see us, but he'd collect those nickels every evening. Dad called it the Conscience Fund," Thomas adds, smiling at the memory. "Said honest thieves deserved to keep their dignity." Sarah Jenkins appears around 10, carrying her famous, or infamous, apple pie. "Thought you might be hungry," she says, setting it down. "Though I warn you, I never did get your recipe quite right." Margaret opens the pie box, inhales the familiar aroma. "Too much cinnamon," she says gently. "And you forgot the cardamom." "Cardamom!" Sarah throws up her hands. "That was the secret after all these years." They share the pie as the morning wears on. Customers come and go, but many linger, drawn by the atmosphere of reunion and reconciliation. Thomas watches Margaret chat with old friends and charm new customers. her silver hair catching the sunlight just as her dark curls used to do. Near noon, Chief Tommy Jenkins stops by in his patrol car. "Mom's pie again?" he asks, helping himself to a slice. "Still trying to compete with the famous Margaret Sullivan recipe?" "Carson," Margaret corrects automatically, then pauses. "Though, I suppose Sullivan was who I was when I learned to bake it." The way she says it makes Thomas look up from the apple he's polishing. Their eyes meet over the display, and something passes between them. A question, perhaps, or a promise. Young Amy Chen, whose grandparents bought the old drugstore, tugs at Margaret's sleeve. "Is it true?" she asks. "Were you really high school sweethearts, like in the movies?" Margaret glances at Thomas, her eyes soft with memory. "Something like that," she says, "though our movie took a bit longer to reach its ending." "Not an ending," Thomas says quietly, "just a new chapter." The market winds down in the afternoon. As they pack up, several customers help carry boxes and fold tables. Small-town courtesy, but also curiosity. Everyone wants to be part of the story, to say they were there when Margaret Sullivan came home. Loading the last crate into Thomas's truck, Margaret finds a nickel on the tailgate. She holds it up, questioning. "Joe Fisher," Thomas explains, "still paying for those apples from '57. Margaret slips the nickel into her pocket. "Some debts take a lifetime to repay, and some things are worth the wait," Thomas replies, closing the tailgate. They drive home in comfortable silence, the old sign rattling gently in the truck bed. The town square fades behind them, but they carry its warmth. The welcome home hugs, the shared memories, the sense of belonging that never really left. "Good day?" Thomas asks as they turn onto the orchard road. Margaret reaches over, takes his hand. "The best. Though, tomorrow will be even better. The fence isn't going to finish itself, you know." Thomas squeezes her hand, and they both smile. Sometimes the best moments aren't the big public reunions, but the quiet ones. Working side by side, building something new from the foundations of the past. The weather changes overnight. Thomas wakes to the sound of wind rattling his windows and the distant rumble of thunder. The old farm ledger on his nightstand shows similar storms this time of year, going back decades. His father's careful handwriting notes the pattern. "October storms come quick, be ready." He's dialing Margaret's number before dawn. "I know," she answers, not bothering with hello. "The apple trees. We need to secure them. You remember what to do?" Like it was yesterday. "I'll meet you in the north orchard." The sky looks bruised as Thomas pulls on his rain gear. Weather alerts flash on his phone. Severe thunderstorm warning, possible hail. Through his kitchen window, he sees Margaret's flashlight beam bobbing through the darkness, heading toward the orchard. They meet by the oldest trees, the ones his grandfather planted. Margaret carries rope and stakes in a canvas bag, her silver hair tucked under a weathered cap. "Just like '56, she says, handing him a coil of rope. "Remember that storm? Dad made us stake every young tree." Thomas tests a branch's flexibility. "Worked all night in the rain. Your mother brought us hot chocolate at midnight." Margaret smiles at the memory, then turns serious. "These new ones here, they're too tall for simple stakes." She's right. The trees they're most worried about are the ones Thomas planted the year she left, now grown tall and heavy with fruit. They've spread their branches wide, making them vulnerable to the strengthening wind. They work quickly, using techniques passed down through generations of apple farmers. Ropes to support heavy branches, temporary stakes to brace trunks, careful pruning where necessary. The wind grows stronger, carrying the scent of rain. Thunder cracks overhead as they reach the last section. These trees are special. The ones. Thomas grafted himself, combining old stock with new varieties. Margaret recognizes his handiwork. "You always were good with grafts," she says, helping him secure a branch. "Making something new from something established." The double meaning hangs between them as the first heavy drops fall. They're soaked within minutes, but they keep working. Every tree matters. Suddenly, Margaret grabs Thomas's arm. "Listen!" Through the wind comes a sound he knows too well. The crack of wood, under strain. One of the older trees, its trunk weakened by age, is starting to split. They race toward it, rain stinging their faces. The tree is one of his father's plantings, over 60 years old. Its trunk has split nearly to the ground, half its crown leaning dangerously. "We need the chain!" Margaret shouts over the wind. Thomas runs for his truck while Margaret begins clearing fallen branches. The scene is so familiar, them working together in a crisis, moving like they can read each other's minds. The chain is heavy, but between them they manage to wrap it around the split trunk. Thomas brings the truck around, using its weight as an anchor point. With careful tension on the chain and strategic rope placement, they slowly pull the split sections back together. "Hold it there," Margaret calls. She works quickly, placing wood blocks as braces, her hands sure, despite the rain. Thomas watches her work, remembering other storms, other rescues. The wind rises to a howl. Around them, their newly secured trees bend but don't break. The old tree's chain holds firm. They stand in the rain, watching, waiting, until the worst of the wind passes. As the storm begins to ease, Margaret touches the old tree's bark. "It'll heal," she says. "With proper care and support, it'll grow stronger at the break." Thomas looks at her, rain running down both their faces. Some things do. They make one final check of the orchard as the sky begins to lighten. The storm has left its mark. Broken branches, scattered fruit, debris everywhere. But the trees stand tall, their roots held firm by years of careful tending. In Margaret's yard, the half-finished fence has weathered its first storm. A few posts lean, but the foundation they built holds strong. "We should check the fence," Thomas says. Margaret nods, but doesn't move. She's looking at the old tree they saved, its chains glinting in the growing light. "You know," she says softly, "some things need to break before they can grow stronger." Thomas takes her hand, weathered and strong like his own. Together, they walk toward the fence, ready to repair whatever the storm has damaged, ready to build something stronger than before. Dawn breaks over a changed landscape. The storm has left its mark on everything. Scattered leaves carpet the ground in gold and red. Broken branches lie where they fell, and the morning sun catches on puddles that mirror the clearing sky. Thomas and Margaret stand at the fence line, surveying the damage. They're both still damp from the night's work, tired but satisfied. The fence post between them bears their carved initials from 1957, revealed when the storm stripped away decades of weathered bark. "Look at that," Margaret says, tracing the old carving with her finger. "TM and MS, still here after all this time." "Dad helped me set this post," Thomas remembers. "Said if I was going to carve up his fence, I'd better make sure it was a post that would last." They begin the cleanup, working in comfortable silence. Margaret gathers fallen apples into her basket. Many can still be used for cider or pies. Thomas clears broken branches, stacking them neatly for later disposal. Their movements are synchronized, each anticipating the other's needs, without words. Inside the old, split tree, where they'd worked so desperately during the storm, new light reveals something unexpected. A small cavity, hidden for years, holds an old tin box. "Thomas," Margaret calls, spotting it first. "Come look at this." He helps her retrieve the box, its surface dulled by years inside the tree. The lid sticks, then opens with a soft pop. Inside, they find a collection of small treasures, a typed letter dated 1957, a pressed apple blossom, and a small velvet ring box. Margaret's hands tremble as she lifts the letter. "This is from your father." Thomas reads over her shoulder. "Son, when you're ready to ask her, use this ring. It was your grandmother's and her mother's before that. Margaret's the right one. I've never seen you happier than when she's around. Don't wait too long. Love has its own timing." The ring box feels heavy in Thomas's hands. "I never knew," he says softly. "He never told me about this." "Open it," Margaret whispers. Inside, the ring catches the morning light, a simple gold band with 3 small diamonds. It's exactly the kind of ring the Margaret of 1957 would have loved. I had one picked out, Thomas admits. Not as nice as this. Was saving up for it, working extra hours at the lumber yard, planned to ask you at the harvest dance. And I left before you could. He closes the ring box gently, places it back in the tin. Wasn't meant to be, not then. Margaret takes the tin, sets it carefully on a fence post. And now? Before Thomas can answer, a truck pulls up to the orchard gate. Sarah Jenkins steps out, carrying a thermos and a basket. "Thought you two might need breakfast," she calls. "Saw your lights on all night during the storm." They sit on the tailgate of Thomas's truck, sharing Sarah's coffee and fresh biscuits. The sunrise paints everything in soft gold, making even the storm damage look somehow beautiful. "Remember when we used to dream about mornings like this?" Margaret asks softly, while Sarah is busy setting out food. "Just us, the orchard, watching the sun come up." "Every dream had you in it," Thomas replies. "Even after they all had you." Sarah pretends not to hear, but her smile is visible as she turns away. She leaves soon after, making excuses about checking on other folks after the storm. They return to their work, clearing debris and straightening fence posts. The morning glory seeds Margaret planted along the fence line have survived the storm, their tiny shoots promising future blooms. "They're stronger than they look," Thomas says, carefully clearing fallen leaves from around the seedlings. "Like some other things I know." Near noon, they reach the old split tree again. The chain they'd wrapped around it gleams wet in the sunlight, holding the wounded trunk together. "It'll need time," Margaret says, running her hand along the rough bark. "And care, but sometimes the broken places are where the most growth happens." Thomas looks at her, really looks at her. The years fall away, and he sees every version of Margaret he's ever known. The laughing girl from the harvest fair, the young woman who left on a rainy night, and now this wise, beautiful person who's found her way back to him. The tin box still sits on the fence post, catching the light. Inside, a grandmother's ring waits. Its time finally come. "Maggie," he begins, but she places a finger on his lips, gentle as a morning glory tendril. "Not yet," she says softly. "We have a fence to finish first, then we'll talk about new beginnings." Around them, the orchard drips with last night's rain, each drop catching sunlight like a tiny star. The air smells of apples and wet earth and possibility. And somewhere Thomas knows his father is smiling. A sleek SUV pulls into Margaret's driveway 3 days later. Thomas watches from the fence line as 3 people emerge, a tall man with graying temples and 2 women who share Margaret's graceful way of moving. Her children. Margaret hurries from her porch to greet them. There are hugs, exclamations, a flurry of activity as luggage is unloaded. Thomas turns back to his fence work, giving them privacy for their reunion. But Margaret's voice carries across the yard. "Thomas, come meet my family." He sets down his tools and walks over, suddenly conscious of his work clothes and muddy boots. Margaret stands proudly with her children, her face glowing. "This is Michael, my oldest." The tall man steps forward, offering a firm handshake. "Sarah, my middle child," the older woman smiles warmly, "and Catherine, my baby." The younger woman studies Thomas with curious eyes. "Though none of us have been babies for quite a while," Catherine says, her voice gentle like her mother's. "It's nice to finally meet you, Thomas. Mom's told us, well, everything." Michael looks around at the half-finished fence. "So this is what brought you back to Montana?" "The fence was an excuse," Margaret admits. "I think I was always finding reasons to come home." They move to the porch where Margaret has set out coffee and her apple pie. Thomas notices she's used the old Miller's Market pie tin, a detail that doesn't escape Sarah's attention. "That's the famous recipe, isn't it?" Sarah asks. "The one you taught us?" "Your grandmother Miller's recipe," Margaret confirms, glancing at Thomas. "With cardamom." "Miller," Catherine says slowly. "So that's why we always had apple trees in our backyard, even in California." Michael remains quiet, studying Thomas with his father's thoughtful expression. Finally he speaks. "Dad knew about you. He used to say Mom's heart was big enough." to love us completely, while still keeping a corner of it here in Montana. Robert was a wise man, Thomas says quietly. He was, Michael agrees. His last words to Mom were, "Don't forget how to be Margaret Sullivan." Margaret pulls out the old family Bible from its shelf. "I want to show you something," she says to her children. Opening it carefully, she reveals the Miller family tree, generations of names written in different hands. "Your father understood about roots," she explains, about how some things can grow in new soil while still honoring where they came from. Catherine traces the names with her finger. "Mom, is that why you used to cry during harvest season?" "Happy tears, mostly," Margaret says, remembering the good times. Sarah pulls out her phone, showing them a photo of her own backyard. "Look familiar?" A row of apple trees stands against the fence, their branches heavy with fruit. "Red Delicious?" Thomas asks. "And Honeycrisp. I got the saplings from a nursery in Washington. They said the stock originally came from Montana." Thomas smiles. "Probably from our orchard. We supplied most of the Northwest nurseries in the 70s. Michael stands, walks to the porch railing. "Mom told us about the ring, about what you found in the tree." A silence falls over the porch. Margaret reaches for Thomas's hand, holds it firmly. "We're not here to stand in the way," Michael continues. "Dad would have approved, you know. He always said true love deserves a second chance." Catherine wipes tears from her eyes. "Besides, who are we to argue with fate or cardamom?" They laugh, and the tension breaks. Sarah helps Margaret serve more pie, while Michael and Thomas discuss irrigation systems. Catherine explores the porch, stopping at the old radio. "Is this the one that plays all the old songs?" she asks. Margaret nods. "Your father, Robert, he used to say those songs told our story. Both stories, really. The one we lived and the one we might have had. And now..." Catherine turns the radio on, and Nat King Cole's voice fills the air. "Now we're writing a new chapter," Margaret says, looking at Thomas, "with room for all our stories." As evening approaches, Thomas excuses himself. There's still work to be done before dark, but as he walks back to the fence, he hears Michael's voice. "Need a hand? I know a thing or two about building fences. Could always use help," Thomas replies. Together they walk to the fence line. Two men who love Margaret in different ways, ready to build something strong enough to join two properties, two lives, two families. Behind them, from the porch, Margaret watches her past and present blend, together like colors in a sunset, like notes in an old love song, like apples ripening in an autumn orchard. The fence is nearly finished. Only the gate remains, the final piece that will connect their properties. Thomas and Margaret stand in the early morning light, studying the property deed Margaret holds in her hands. "It's a big decision," Thomas says, watching her face. "Combining the properties." "Bigger than just land," Margaret agrees. She looks up at the apple trees, their branches stretching over both yards. Though these trees never did care much about property lines. They sit on the porch steps, where they've spent so many evenings this past week. The deed lies between them, fresh from the lawyer's office. One signature would join the Peterson place with Miller Orchards, making it all one property again, just as it was before 1957. "Michael thinks we're moving too fast," Margaret says, tracing the property line on the deed with her finger. "And what do you think?" She smiles. "I think 67 years is slow enough." The morning glory vines they planted are beginning to climb the fence posts, their first buds promising purple blooms. Like everything else in their story, they've taken their time, growing stronger for the wait. "You know," Thomas says, pulling out his father's old farm ledger, "Dad wrote something here the day after you left." He opens to a page marked with a faded ribbon. Says, "Some harvests take longer than others. The sweetest fruit often needs the most time to ripen." Margaret takes the ledger, runs her fingers over the familiar handwriting. "He wrote to me about this orchard for 15 years, never missed a season, always signed his letters, keeping your roots watered." Thomas reaches into his pocket, takes out the ring box they found in the old tree. "Speaking of roots, Thomas Miller, if you're about to propose on these porch steps without fixing, "In that gate first," he laughs. "Wouldn't dream of it. Some things need to be done right." They walk to the unfinished gate together. The morning sun catches on the new wood, on the aged metal of Thomas's tools, on the silver in their hair. "I've been thinking," Margaret says, picking up a hammer, "about what to call it. The gate. The whole place. Once it's joined." She hands him a nail. "Miller Carson Orchards has a nice ring to it." Thomas tests the gate's swing. "Or Carson Miller. Or just Miller Orchards," she says softly. "If you're asking and if I'm saying yes." He turns to her, hammer still in hand. "Are you? Asking or saying yes?" "Either, both." Margaret picks up the gate latch, holds it in position. "Well, someone once told me that a gate needs both sides to work properly. One side to hold fast, one side to swing free. But they're both just as important." Thomas marks the spot for the latch. "Sounds like a wise person." "Oh, he has his moments." She steadies the latch while he drives the screws. Usually when he's building something, they work in comfortable silence, fitting the pieces together. The gate takes shape under their hands, strong and true. When it's done, they test it together. The smooth swing, the solid click of the latch. Thomas takes out the ring box one more time. "Now?" Margaret looks at their finished gate, at the morning glories climbing toward the sun, at the apple trees, stretching their branches over both properties. She thinks of her children's blessing, of Robert's last words, of all the years between then and now. "Now," she agrees. He opens the box, takes out his grandmother's ring. It catches the morning light, throwing sparkles on their joined hands. "Margaret Sullivan Carson," he begins. "Yes," she says before he can finish. "Yes to all of it. To joining the properties, to becoming Margaret Miller, to finishing what we started 67 years ago." He slips the ring onto her finger. It fits perfectly, as if it's been waiting all these years, just for this moment. "You didn't let me ask." "Properly," he teases. "Ask me tomorrow," she says, "and the day after that. Ask me every morning over coffee, every evening when we check the trees. Ask me until we've made up for all the days we couldn't ask each other anything at all." They walk through their gate together, letting it swing shut behind them with a satisfying click. Above them, the apple trees rustle in the morning breeze, dropping petals like confetti on their shoulders. "Your father was right," Margaret says, looking at her ring. "The sweetest fruit does take the longest to ripen." "Worth the wait?" Thomas asks. She reaches up, brushes apple blossoms from his silver hair. "Every single day." 1 year later, the morning glories cover the entire fence line, their purple blooms creating a living wall between what were once two separate properties. The old farm journal lies open on the kitchen table, ready for a new entry. But today, Thomas and Margaret Miller have more pressing matters to attend to. "The sign needs to go higher on the left," Margaret calls from the driveway. She's directing their grandchildren, her 3 and Thomas's sisters 2, as they hang the new Miller Family Orchards sign over the entrance. "Grandma, is it true this is where you first met Grandpa Tom?" Amy, the youngest, asks. "Not quite." "Here," Margaret says, adjusting her sun hat. "It was at the harvest fair. I was new in town, and your grandfather was selling the prettiest apples I'd ever seen." Thomas joins them, carrying a fresh-picked basket of Honeycrisp. "She pretended to be interested in the apples," he says with a wink. "But I knew better." "Oh, and what was I interested in?" "The handsome young farmer, of course." Their laughter draws Michael over from where he's setting up tables for today's gathering. "Mum, Dad's looking for you. Something about the pie recipe still not being—" "Quite right." The way Michael says Dad, natural, easy, full of affection, makes Margaret's heart swell. It had been his idea, calling Thomas that. Some families, he'd said at the wedding, are lucky enough to get 2 good fathers. Inside the kitchen, Robert's photos share space with the Miller family pictures on the wall. Margaret believes both. Men would have liked that arrangement, the past and present together, each given its proper respect. The old radio plays softly on the windowsill as she helps Thomas with the pies. Elvis sings "Love Me Tender," and they dance a few steps between the counter and the oven, comfortable in their shared rhythm. "Remember teaching me to dance in the barn?" Margaret asks, reaching for the cardamom. "Remember teaching our grandkids? In that same barn last week, outside cars begin arriving for the orchard's annual harvest festival. But this year is special. It's also their first anniversary. The entire town seems to have turned out, carrying dishes and stories and good wishes. Sarah Jenkins arrives first, as always, carrying her apple pie. "Finally got the recipe right," she announces proudly. "Only took me 68 years. The day unfolds like a well-loved book. Children run between the apple trees, playing the same games Thomas and Margaret once played. Old friends share memories, and new friends make more. The orchard embraces them all, its branches heavy with fruit and history. Near sunset, Thomas leads Margaret to their special spot, the old tree that split in the storm, now healed and stronger. At its mended place, the chain that saved it has been transformed into a garden arch, morning glories twining through its links. "Look what I found," he says, pulling out a small envelope. Inside is a black-and-white photograph, creased but clear. Two young people at a harvest fair, surrounded by apples and possibility. "Where did this come from?" "Betty Henderson dropped it off this morning. Said she found it in Charles's things after he passed. Thought we might want it." Margaret studies the photo, her young self looking at young Thomas with undisguised adoration. "We had no idea what was coming, did we? Would you change it? If you could." She thinks of Robert, of her children, of all the life she lived between then and now. "No," she says finally. "Every step led us here, even the hard ones." As if on cue, the old radio signal strengthens. Nat King Cole's "Unforgettable" drifts across the orchard. Thomas holds out his hand. "Dance with me, Mrs. Miller." They sway together under the apple trees, their feet following paths worn smooth by time and love. Around them, the orchard buzzes with life. Children's laughter, friends' conversations, the gentle rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. The fence that brought them back together stands strong, its gate swinging free. Morning glories bloom along its length, their purple flowers closing as day fades to dusk. Soon they'll need to join their guests, cut the anniversary cake, make plans for tomorrow's harvest. But for now, they dance. Two people who found their way back to where they began, who learned that love, like apples, grows sweetest when given the time it needs. Their story, like the orchard itself, has deep roots and new growth, fed by memories of yesterday and promises of tomorrow. And in the fading light, as their family and friends gather close, Thomas and Margaret Miller hold each other and smile, knowing that sometimes the longest roads lead us right where we were always meant to be. In the end, it's not just a story about a fence that needed fixing, it's about hearts that needed mending, time that needed passing, and love that needed exactly 67 years to ripen to perfection. Just like the best apples in Thomas's orchard, just like the sweetest memories in Margaret's heart, just like the morning glories that bloom anew each day along the fence that brought them home.